Chapter 51 of Ralph the Heir by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Music has its charms. The commission appointed to examine into the condition of the borough of Percycross cannot exactly be said to have made short work of it, for it sat daily for many consecutive weeks, and examined half the voters in the town. But it made sharp work, and reported to the Speaker of the House such a tale of continual corruption that all the world knew that the borough would be disfranchised. The glory of Percycross was gone, and in regard to political influence it was to be treated as the cities of the plain and blotted from off the face of existence. The learned gentleman who formed the commission had traced home to Mr. Griffenbottom's breeches pockets large sums of money, which had been expended in the borough for purposes of systematized corruption during the whole term of his connection with it. And yet they were not very hard upon Mr. Griffenbottom personally in their report. He had spent the money, no doubt, but had so spent it that at every election it appeared that he had not expected to spend it till the bills were sent to him. He frankly owned that the borough had been ruinous to him, had made a poor man of him, but assured the commission at the same time that all this had come from his continued innocence. As every new election came round, he had hoped that that would at least be pure, and had been urgent in his instructions to his agents to that effect. He had at last learned, he said, that he was not a sufficient Hercules to cleanse so foul a stable. All this created no animosity against him in Percycross during the sitting of the commission. His old friends, the Triggers and Piles and Spiveycombs, clung to him as closely as ever. Every man in Percycross knew that the borough was gone, and there really seemed at last to be something of actual gratitude in their farewell behaviour to the man who had treated the place as it liked to be treated. At the end of it all, the borough was undoubtedly to be disfranchised, and Mr. Griffenbottom left it, a ruined man, indeed, according to his own statement, but still with his colours flying, and to a certain extent triumphantly. So we will leave him, trusting, or perhaps rather hoping, that the days of Mr. Griffenbottom are nearly at an end. His colleague, Sir Thomas, on the occasion of his third visit to Percycross, a visit which he was constrained to make sorely against his will, in order that he might give his evidence before the commission, remained there but a very short time. But while there he made a clean breast of it. He had gone down to the borough with the most steadfast purpose to avoid corruption, and had done his best in that direction. But he had failed. There had been corruption, for which he had himself paid in part. There had been treating of the grossest kind. Money had been demanded from him since the election, as to the actual destination of which he was profoundly ignorant. He did not, however, doubt but that this money had been spent in the purchase of votes. Sir Thomas was supposed to have betrayed the borough in his evidence, and was hooted out of the town. On this occasion he only remained there one night, and left Percycross for ever, after giving his evidence. This happened during the second week in May. On his return to London he did not go down to Fulham, but remained at his chambers in a most unhappy frame of mind. This renewed attempt of his to enter the world, and to go among men, that he might do a man's work, had resulted in the loss of a great many £100, in absolute failure, and, as he wrongly told himself, in personal disgrace. He was almost ashamed to show himself at his club, and did for 2 days absolutely have his dinner brought to him in his chambers from an eating-house. "I'm sure you won't like that, Sir Thomas," Stemm had said to him, expostulating, and knowing very well the nature of his master's sufferings. "I don't know that I like anything very much," said Sir Thomas. "I wouldn't go and not show my face because of other people's roguery," rejoined Stemm, with a cruel audacity. Sir Thomas looked at him, but did not answer a word, and Stemm fetched the food. "Stemm," said Sir Thomas the same evening, "it's getting to be fine weather now." "It's fine enough," said Stemm. "Do you take your nieces down to Southend for an outing?" "Go down on Thursday and come back on Saturday. I shall be at home. There's a £5 note for the expenses." Stemm slowly took the note, but grunted and grumbled. The girls were nuisances to him, and he didn't want to take them an outing. They wouldn't care to go before July, and he didn't care to go at all. "You can go when you please," said Sir Thomas. Stemm growled and grumbled, and at last left the room with the money. The morning afterwards Sir Thomas was sitting alone in his rooms, absolutely wretched. He had so managed his life that there seemed to be nothing left to him in it worth the having. He had raised himself to public repute by his intellect and industry, and had then, almost at once, allowed himself to be hustled out of the throng simply because others had been rougher than he, because other men had pushed and shouldered, while he had been quiet and unpretending. Then he had resolved to make up for this disappointment by work of another kind, by work which would, after all, be more congenial to him. He would go back to the dream of his youth, to the labours of former days, and would in truth write his Life of Bacon. He had then surrounded himself with his papers, had gotten his books together, and read up his old notes, had planned chapters and sections, and settled divisions, had drawn up headings, and revelled in those paraphernalia of work which are so dear to would-be working men. And then nothing had come of it. Of what use was it that he went about ever with a volume in his pocket, and read a page or two as he sat over his wine? When sitting alone in his room he did read, but when reading he knew that he was not working. He went, as it were, round and round the thing, never touching it till the labour which he longed to commence became so frightful to him that he did not dare to touch it. To do that thing was the settled purpose of his life, and yet from day to day, and from month to month, it became more impossible to him even to make a beginning. There is a misery in this which only they who have endured it can understand. There are idle men who rejoice in idleness. Their name is legion. Idleness, even when it is ruinous, is delightful to them. They revel in it, look forward to it, and almost take a pride in it. When it can be had without pecuniary detriment, it is to such men a thing absolutely good in itself. But such a one was not Sir Thomas Underwood. And there are men who love work, who revel in that, who attack it daily with renewed energy, almost wallowing in it, greedy of work, who go to it almost as the drunkard goes to his bottle, or the gambler to his gaming table. These are not unhappy men, though they are perhaps apt to make those around them unhappy. But such a one was not Sir Thomas Underwood. And again there are men, fewer in number, who will work though they hate it, from sheer conscience and from conviction that idleness will not suit them or make them happy. Strong men these are, but such a one certainly was not Sir Thomas Underwood. Then there are they who love the idea of work, but want the fibre needful for the doing of it. It may be that such a one will earn his bread as Sir Thomas Underwood had earned his, not flinching from routine task or even from the healthy efforts necessary for subsistence. But there will ever be present to the mind of the ambitious man the idea of something to be done over and above the mere earning of his bread. And the ambition may be very strong, though the fibre be lacking. Such a one will endure an agony protracted for years, always intending, never performing, self-accusing through every wakeful hour, self-accusing almost through every sleeping hour. The work to be done is close there by the hand, but the tools are loathed, and the paraphernalia of it become hateful. And yet it can never be put aside. It is to be grasped to-morrow, but on every morrow the grasping of it becomes more difficult, more impossible, more revolting. There is no peace, no happiness for such a man, and such a one was Sir Thomas Underwood. In this strait he had been tempted to make another effort in political life. He had made it. There had been no difficulty in this, only that the work itself had been so disagreeable, and that he had failed in it so egregiously. During his canvass, and in all his intercourse with the Griffin-Bottomites, he had told himself, falsely, how pleasant to him it would be to return to his books. How much better for him would be a sedentary life, if he could only bring himself to do, or even to attempt to do, the work which he had appointed for himself. Now he had returned to his solitude, had again dragged out his papers, his note-book, his memoranda, his dates, and yet he could not in truth get into his harness, put his neck to the collar, and attempt to drag the burden up the hill. He was sitting alone in his room in this condition, with a book in his hand of no value to his great purpose, hating himself and wretched, when Stemm opened his door, ushering Patience and Mary Bonner into his room. "Ah, my dears," he said, "what has brought you up to London? I did not think of seeing you here." There was no expression of positive displeasure in his voice, but it was understood by them all, by the daughter, by the cousin, by old Stemm, and by Sir Thomas himself, that such a visit as this was always to be regarded more or less as an intrusion. However, he kissed them both, and handed them chairs, and was more than usually civil to them. "We do want to hear about Percycross, papa," said Patience. "There is nothing to be told about Percycross." "Are you to stand again, papa?" "Nobody will ever stand for Percycross again. It will lose its members altogether. The thing is settled." "And you have had all the trouble for nothing, uncle?" Mary asked. "All for nothing, and the expense. But that is a very common thing, and I have no ground of complaint beyond many others." "It does seem so hard," said Patience. "So very hard," said Mary. And then they were silent. They had not come without a purpose, but, as is common with young ladies, they kept their purpose for the end of the interview. "Are you coming home, papa?" Patience asked. "Well, yes. I won't settle any day now, because I am very busy just at present. But I shall be home soon, very soon." "I do so hope you'll stay some time with us, papa." "My dear, you know." And then he stopped, having been pounced upon so suddenly that he had not resolved what excuse he would for the moment put forward. "I've got my papers and things in such confusion here at present, because of Percycross and the trouble I have had, that I cannot leave them just now." "But why not bring the papers with you, papa?" "My dear, you know I can't." Then there was another pause. "Papa, I think you ought," said Patience. Indeed I do, for Clary's sake, and ours." But even this was not the subject which had specially brought them on that morning to Southampton Buildings. "What is there wrong with Clary?" asked Sir Thomas. "There is nothing wrong," said Patience. "What do you mean, then?" "I think it would be so much more comfortable for her that you should see things as they are going on." "I declare I don't know what she means. Do you know what she means, Mary?" "Clary has not been quite herself lately," said Mary. "I suppose it's something about that scamp Ralph Newton," said Sir Thomas. "No, indeed, papa. I am sure she does not think of him now." On this very morning, as the reader may perhaps remember, the scamp had gone down to Fulham, and from Fulham back to Brompton, in search of Clarissa. But of the scamp's energy and renewed affections Patience as yet knew nothing. "Gregory has been up in London, and has been down at Fulham once or twice. We want him to come again before he goes back on Saturday, and we thought that if you would come home on Thursday we could ask him to dinner." Sir Thomas scratched his head and fidgeted in his chair. "Their cousin is in London also," continued Patience. "The other Ralph, he who has bought Beamingham Hall?" "Yes, papa. We saw him at the Academy. I told him how happy you would be to see him at Fulham." "Of course I should be glad to see him, that is, if I happened to be at home," said Sir Thomas. "But I could not name a day without asking you, papa." "He will have gone back by this time," said Sir Thomas. "I think not, papa." "And what do you say, Mary?" "I have nothing to say at all, uncle. If Mr. Newton likes to come to the villa, I shall be glad to see him. Why should I not? He has done nothing to offend me." There was a slight smile on her face as she spoke, and the merest hint of a blush on her cheek. "They tell me that Beamingham Hall isn't much of a place after all," said Sir Thomas. "From what Mr. Newton says, it must be a very ugly place," said Mary, with still the same smile and the same hint of a blush. "Only I don't quite credit all he tells us." "Is there anything settled you ought to tell me?" said Sir Thomas. "There is nothing settled, uncle, or in any way of being settled. It so happened that Mr. Newton did speak to me about his new house. There is nothing more. Nevertheless, papa, pray let us ask him to dinner on Thursday." It was for the purpose of making this request that Patience had come to Southampton Buildings, braving her father's displeasure. Sir Thomas scratched his head, and rubbed his face, and yielded. Of course he had no alternative but to yield, and yet he did it with a bad grace. Permission, however, was given, and it was understood that Patience would write to the two young men, Ralph of Beamingham Hall and the parson, asking them to dinner for the day but one following. "As the time is so short, I've written the notes already," said Patience, producing them from her pocket. Then the bell was rung, and the two notes were confided to Stemm. Patience, as she was going, found a moment in which to be alone with her father, and to speak one more word to him. "Dear papa, it would be so much better for us that you should come and live at home. Think of those two, with nobody, as it were, to say a word for them." Sir Thomas groaned, and again scratched his head, but Patience left him before he had arranged his words for an answer. When they were gone, Sir Thomas sat for hours in his chair without moving, making the while one or two faint attempts at the book before him, but in truth giving up his mind to contemplation of the past and to conjectures as to the future, burdened by heavy regrets, and with hopes too weak to afford him any solace. The last words which Patience had spoken rang in his ears.
"Think of those two with nobody, as it were, to say a word for them."
He did think of them, and of the speaker also, and knew that he had neglected his duty. He could understand that such a girl as his own Clarissa did require some one to say a word for her, some stalwart arm to hold her up, some loving strength to support her, some counsel to direct her. Of course those three girls were as other girls, looking forward to matrimony as their future lot in life, and it would not be well that they should be left to choose or to be chosen, or left to reject and be rejected, without any aid from the remaining parent. He knew that he had been wrong, and he almost resolved that the chambers in Southampton Buildings should be altogether abandoned, and his books removed to Popham Villa. But such men do not quite resolve. Before he could lay his hand upon the table and assure himself that the thing should be done, the volume had been taken up again, used for a few minutes, and then the man's mind had run away again to that vague contemplation which is so much easier than the forming of a steady purpose. It was one of those almost sultry days which do come to us occasionally amidst the ordinary inclemency of a London May, and he was sitting with his window open, though there was a fire in the grate. As he sat, dreaming rather than thinking, there came upon his ear the weak, wailing, puny sound of a distant, melancholy flute. He had heard it often before, and had been roused by it to evil wishes, and sometimes even to evil words, against the musician. It was the effort of some youth in the direction of Staples Inn to soothe with music the savageness of his own bosom. It was borne usually on the evening air, but on this occasion the idle swain had taken up his instrument within an hour or two of his early dinner. His melody was burdened with no peculiar tune, but consisted of a few low, wailing, melancholy notes, such as may be extracted from the reed by a breath and the slow raising and falling of the little finger, much, we believe, to the comfort of the player, but to the ineffable disgust of, too often, a large circle of hearers. Sir Thomas was affected by the sound long before he was aware that he was listening to it. "To-hoo, to-hoo, 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 hoo, to-too, hoo, to-too, hoo, hoo." On the present occasion the variation was hardly carried beyond that, but so much was repeated with a persistency which at last seemed to burden the whole air around Southampton Buildings. The little thing might have been excluded by the closing of the window, but Sir Thomas, though he suffered, did not reflect for a while whence the suffering came. Who does not know how such sounds may serve to enhance the bitterness of remorse, to add a sorrow to the present thoughts, and to rob the future of its hopes? There come upon us all, as we grow up in years, hours in which it is impossible to keep down the conviction that everything is vanity, that the life past has been vain from folly, and that the life to come must be vain from impotence. It is the presence of thoughts such as these that needs the assurance of a heaven to save the thinker from madness or from suicide. It is when the feeling of this pervading vanity is strongest on him that he who doubts of heaven most regrets his incapacity for belief. If there be nothing better than this on to the grave, and nothing worse beyond the grave, why should I bear such fardels? Sir Thomas, as he sat there listening and thinking, unable not to think and not to listen, found that the fardels were very heavy. What good had come to him of his life, to him or to others? And what further good did he dare to promise to himself? Had it not all been vanity? Was it not all vain to him now at the present? Was not life becoming to him vainer and still vainer every day? He had promised himself once that books should be the solace of his age, and he was beginning to hate his books because he knew that he did no more than trifle with them. He had found himself driven to attempt to escape from them back into public life, but had failed, and had been inexpressibly dismayed in the failure. While failing, he had promised himself that he would rush at his work on his return to privacy and to quiet. But he was still as the shivering coward who stands upon the brink and cannot plunge in among the bathers. And then there was sadness beyond this, and even deeper than this. Why should he have dared to arrange for himself a life different from the life of the ordinary men and women who lived around him? Why had he not contented himself with having his children around him, walking with them to church on Sunday morning, taking them to the theatre on Monday evening, and allowing them to read him to sleep after tea on the Tuesday? He had not done these things, was not doing them now, because he had ventured to think himself capable of something that would justify him in leaving the common circle. He had left it, but was not justified. He had been in Parliament, had been in office, and had tried to write a book, but he was not a legislator, was not a statesman, and was not an author. He was simply a weak, vain, wretched man, who, through false conceit, had been induced to neglect almost every duty of life. To-whew, 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 to-whew. As the sounds filled his ears, such were the thoughts which lay heavy on his bosom. So idle as he had been in thinking, so inconclusive, so frail, so subject to gusts of wind, so incapable of following his subject to the end, why had he dared to leave that Sunday-keeping, church-going, domestic, decent life, which would have become one of so ordinary a calibre as himself? There are men who may doubt, who may weigh the evidence, who may venture to believe or disbelieve in compliance with their own reasoning faculties, who may trust themselves to think it out. But he, too clearly, had not been, was not, and never would be one of these. To walk as he saw other men walking around him, because he was one of the many, to believe that to be good which the teachers appointed for him declared to be good, to do prescribed duties without much personal inquiry into the causes which had made them duties, to listen patiently, and to be content without excitement, that was the mode of living for which he should have known himself to be fit. But he had not known it, and had strayed away, and had ventured to think that he could think, and had been ambitious, and now he found himself stranded in the mud of personal condemnation, and that so late in life that there remained to him no hope of escape. Stem, why do you let that brute go on with his cursed flute? Stem at that moment had opened the door to suggest that, as he usually dined at 1, and as it was now past 3, he would go out and get a bit of something to eat. "He is always at it, sir," said Stem, pausing for a moment before he alluded to his own wants. "Why the deuce is he always at it? Why isn't he indicted for a nuisance? Who's to do anything with such a noise as that going on for hours together? He has nearly driven me mad." "It's young Wobble as has the back attic, number 17 in the inn," said Stem. "They ought to turn him out," said Sir Thomas. "I rather like it myself," said Stem. "It suits my disposition, sir." Then he made his little suggestion in regard to his own personal needs, and of course was blown up for not having come in 2 hours ago to remind Sir Thomas that it was dinner time. "It's because I wouldn't disturb you when you has the bacon papers out, Sir Thomas," said Stem serenely. Sir Thomas winced and shook his head, but such scenes as this were too common to have much effect. "Stemm!" he called aloud, as soon as the old clerk had closed the door. "Stemm!" Whereupon Stemm reappeared. "Stemm, have some one here next week to pack all these books." "Pack all the books, Sir Thomas?" "Yes, to pack all the books. There must be cases. Now go and get your dinner." "New cases, Sir Thomas?" "That will do. Go and get your dinner." And yet his mind was not quite made up. End of chapter 51. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 52 of Ralph the Heir by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gus Eardham. Whether Mr. Neefit broke Ralph Newton's little statuette, a miniature copy in porcelain of the Apollo Belvedere, which stood in a corner of Ralph's room, and in the possession of which he took some pride, from awkwardness in his wrath or of malice prepense, was never known. He told the servant that he had whisked it down with his coat tails, but Ralph always thought that the breeches maker had intended to make a general ruin, but had been cowed by the noise of his first attack. He did at any rate abstain from breaking other things, and when the servant entered the room condescended to make some careless apology. "A little trifle like that ain't nothing between me and your master, Jack," said Mr. Neefit, after accounting for the accident by his coat tails. "I am not Jack," said the indignant valet, with a strong foreign accent. "I am named Adolphe." "Adolphe, are you? I don't think much of Adolphe for a name, but it ain't no difference to me. Just pick up them bits, will you?" The man turned a look of scorn on Mr. Neefit, and did pick up the bits. He intended to obey his master as far as might be possible, but was very unwilling to wait upon the breeches maker. He felt that the order which had been given to him was very cruel. It was his duty and his pleasure to wait upon gentlemen, but this man he knew to be a tradesman who measured customers for hunting apparel in his own shop. It was hard upon him that his master should go and leave him to be insulted, ordered about, and trodden upon by a breeches maker. "Get me a bit of steak, will you?" demanded Neefit. "A bit of the rump, not too much done, with the gravy in it, and an onion. What are you staring at? Didn't you hear what your master said to you?" "Onion and rump steak." "Yes, rump steak and onion. I ain't going out of this till I've had a bit of grub. Your master knows all about it. I'm going to have more nor that out of him before I've done with him." Neefit did at last succeed, and had his rump steak and onion, together with more brandy and soda water, eating and drinking as he sat in Ralph's beautiful new easy chair, not very much to his own comfort. A steak at the Prince's Feathers in Conduit Street would have been very much more pleasant to him, and he would have preferred half and half in the pewter to brandy and soda water. But he felt a pride in using his power in a fashion that would be disgraceful to his host. When he had done his steak, he pulled his pipe out of his pocket and smoked. Against this Adolphe remonstrated stoutly, but quite in vain. "The captain won't mind a little baccy smoke out of my pipe," he said. "He always has his smoke comfortable when he comes down to me." At last, about 4 o'clock, he did go away, assuring Adolphe that he would repeat his visit very soon. "I means to see a deal of the captain this season," he said. At last, however, he retreated, and Adolphe opened the door of the house for him without speaking a word. "Bye bye," said Neefit. "I'll be here again before long." Ralph on that afternoon came home to dress for dinner at about 7, in great fear lest Neefit should still be found in his rooms. "No, sir, he go away at last," said Adolphe, with a melancholy shake of his head. "Has he done much harm?" "The Apollo gone, and he had a hump steak and onions, and a pipe. Vat vas I to do? I hope he will never come again." And so also did Mr. Newton hope that Neefit would never come again. He was going to dine with Lady Eardham, the wife of a Berkshire baronet, who had 3 fair daughters. At this period of his life he found the aristocracy of Berkshire and Hampshire to be very civil to him, and indeed the world at large was disposed to smile on him. But there was very much in his lot to make him unhappy. He had on that morning been utterly rejected by Clarissa Underwood. It may perhaps be true that he was not a man to break his heart because a girl rejected him. He was certainly one who could have sung the old song, "If she be not fair for me, what care I how fair she be?" And yet Clarissa's conduct had distressed him, and had caused him to go about throughout the whole afternoon with his heart almost in his boots. He had felt her coldness to him much more severely than he had that of Mary Bonner. He had taught himself to look upon that little episode with Mary as though it had really meant nothing. She had just crossed the sky of his heaven like a meteor, and for a moment had disturbed its serenity. And Polly also had been to him a false light, leading him astray for a while under exceptional, and, as he thought, quite pardonable circumstances. But dear little Clary had been his own peculiar star, a star that was bound to have been true to him, even though he might have erred for a moment in his worship, a star with a sweet, soft, enduring light, that he had always assured himself he might call his own when he pleased. And now this soft, sweet star had turned upon him and scorched him. "When I get home," she said to him, "I shall find that you have already made an offer to Patience." He certainly had not expected such scorn from her. And then he was so sure in his heart that if she would have accepted him, he would have been henceforth so true to her, so good to her. He would have had such magnanimous pleasure in showering upon her pretty little head all the good things at his disposal, that for her own sake the pity was great. When he had been 5 minutes in his cab, bowling back toward his club, he was almost minded to return and give her one more chance. She would just have suited him. And as for her, would it not be a heaven on earth for her if she would only consent to forget that foolish, unmeaning little episode? Could Clary have forgotten the episode and been content to care little or nothing for that easiness of feeling which made our Ralph what he was, she might probably have been happy as the mistress of the Priory. But she would not have forgotten, and would not have been content. She had made up her little heart stoutly that Ralph the heir should sit in it no longer, and it was well for him that he did not go back. He went to his club instead, not daring to go to his rooms. The insanity of Neefit was becoming to him a terrible bane. It was, too, a cruelty which he certainly had done nothing to deserve. He could lay his hand on his heart and assure himself that he had treated that mad, pig-headed tradesman well in all respects. He knew himself to be the last man to make a promise and then to break it wilfully. He had certainly borrowed money of Neefit, and at the probable cost of all his future happiness he had, with a nobleness which he could not himself sufficiently admire, done his very best to keep the hard terms which in his distress he had allowed to be imposed upon himself. He had been loyal even to the breeches maker, and this was the return which was made to him. What was he to do, should Neefit cling to his threat and remain permanently at his chambers? There were the police, and no doubt he could rid himself of his persecutor. But he understood well the barbarous power which some underbred, well-trained barrister would have of asking him questions which it would be so very disagreeable for him to answer. He lacked the courage to send for the police. Jacky Joram had just distinguished himself greatly and nearly exterminated a young gentleman who had married one girl while he was engaged to another. Jacky Joram might ask him questions as to his little dinners at Alexandra Lodge, which it would nearly kill him to answer. He was very unhappy, and began to think that it might be as well that he should travel for 12 months. Neefit could not persecute him up the Nile, or among the Rocky Mountains, and perhaps Clary's ferocity would have left her, would he return after 12 months of glorious journeyings, still constant to his first affections. In the meantime he did not dare to go home till it would be absolutely necessary that he should dress for dinner. In the billiard-room of his club he found Lord Polperrow, the eldest son of the Marquis of Megavissey, Pretty Poll as he was called by many young men, and by some of the young ladies about town. Lord Polperrow had become his fast friend since the day on which his heirship was established, and now he encountered him with friendly intimacy. "Hallo, Newton," said the young lord. "Have you seen old Neefit lately?" There were 8 or 10 men in the room, and suddenly there was silence among the cues. Ralph would have given his best horse to be able to laugh it off, but he found that he could not laugh. He became very hot, and knew that he was red in the face. "What about old Neefit?" he said. "I've just come from Conduit Street, and he says that he has been dining with you. He swears that you are to marry his daughter." "He be damned," said Newton. It was a poor way of getting out of the scrape, and so Ralph felt. "But what's the meaning of it all? He's telling everybody in London that you went down to stay with him at Margate." "Neefit has gone mad lately," said Captain Fooks, with a good-natured determination to stand by his friend in misfortune. "But how about the girl, Newton?" asked his lordship. "You may have her yourself, Poll, if she don't prefer a young shoemaker to whom I believe she's engaged. She's very pretty, and has got a lot of money, which will suit you to a T." He tried to put a good face on it, but nevertheless he was very hot and red in the face. "I'd put a stop to this if I were you," said another friend, confidentially and in a whisper. "He's not only telling everybody, but writing letters about it." "Oh, I know," said Ralph. "How can I help what a madman does? It's a bore, of course." Then he sauntered out again, feeling sure that his transactions with Mr. Neefit would form the subject of conversation in the club billiard-room for the next hour and a half. It would certainly become expedient that he should travel abroad. He felt it to be quite a relief when he found that Mr. Neefit was not waiting for him at his chambers. "Adolphe," he said, as soon as he was dressed, "that man must never be allowed to put his foot inside the door again." "Ah, the Apollo gone, and he did it express." "I don't mind the figure, but he must never be allowed to enter this place again. I shall not stay up long, but while we are here you must not leave the place till 6. He won't come in the evening." Then he put a sovereign into the man's hands, and went out to dine at Lady Eardham's. Lady Eardham had 3 fair daughters, with pretty necks, and flaxen hair, and blue eyes, and pug noses, all wonderfully alike. They ranged from 27 to 21, there being sons between, and it began to be desirable that they should be married. Since Ralph had been in town, the Eardham mansion in Cavendish Square had been opened to him with almost maternal kindness. He had accepted the kindness, but being fully alive to the purposes of matronly intrigue, had had his little jokes in reference to the young ladies. He liked young ladies generally, but was well aware that a young man is not obliged to offer his hand and heart to every girl that is civil to him. He and the Eardham girls had been exceedingly intimate, but he had had no idea whatever of sharing Newton Priory with an Eardham. Now, however, in his misery he was glad to go to a house in which he would be received with an assured welcome. Everybody smiled upon him. Sir George in these days was very cordial, greeting him with that genial esoteric warmth which is always felt by one English country gentleman with a large estate for another equally blessed. 6 months ago, when it was believed that Ralph had sold his inheritance to his uncle, Sir George, when he met the young man, addressed him in a very different fashion. As he entered the room he felt the warmth of the welcoming. The girls, one and all, had ever so many things to say to him. They all hunted, and they all wanted him to look at horses for them. Lady Eardham was more matronly than ever, and at the same time was a little fussy. She would not leave him among the girls, and at last succeeded in getting him off into a corner of the back drawing-room. "Now, Mr. Newton," she said, "I am going to show you that I put the greatest confidence in you." "So you may," said Ralph, wondering whether one of the girls was to be offered to him out of hand. At the present moment he was so low in spirits that he would probably have taken either. "I have had a letter," said Lady Eardham, whispering the words into his ear, and then she paused. "Such a strange letter, and very abominable. I've shown it to no one, not even to Sir George. I wouldn't let one of the girls see it for ever so much." Then there was another pause. "I don't believe a word of it, Mr. Newton, but I think it right to show it to you, because it's about you." "About me?" said Ralph, with his mind fixed at once upon Mr. Neefit. "Yes, indeed. And when I tell you it refers to my girls too, you will see how strong is my confidence in you. If either had been specially named, of course I could not have shown it." Then she handed him the letter, which poor Ralph read as follows: "My lady, I'm told as Mr. Ralph Newton of Newton Priory is sweet upon one of your ladyship's daughters. I think it my duty to tell your ladyship he's engaged to marry my girl, Maryanne Neefit. Yours most respectful, Thomas Neefit, Breeches Maker, Conduit Street." "It's a lie," said Ralph. "I'm sure it's a lie," said Lady Eardham, "only I thought it right to show it to you." Ralph took Gus Eardham down to dinner, and did his very best to make himself agreeable. Gus was the middle one of the three, and was certainly a fine girl. The Eardham girls would have no money, but Ralph was not a greedy man, except when he was in great need. It must not be supposed, however, that on this occasion he made up his mind to marry Gus Eardham. But, as on previous occasions, he had been able to hold all the Eardhams in a kind of subjection to himself, feeling himself to be bigger than they, as hitherto he had been conscious that he was bestowing and they receiving. So now, in his present misfortune, did he recognise that Gus was a little bigger than himself, and that it was for her to give and for him to take. And Gus was able to talk to him as though she also entertained the same conviction. Gus was very kind to him, and he felt grateful to her. Lady Eardham saw Gus alone in her bedroom that night. "I believe he's a very good young man," said Lady Eardham, "if he's managed rightly. And as for all this about the horrid man's daughter,
It don't matter at all. He'd live it down in a month if he were married." "I don't think anything about that, mamma. I dare say he's had his fun, just like other men." "Only, my dear, he's one of that sort that have to be fixed." "It's so hard to fix them, mamma." "It needn't be hard to fix him, that is, if you'll only be steady. He's not sharp and hard and callous like some of them. He doesn't mean any harm, and if he once speaks out he isn't one that can't be kept to time. His manners are nice. I don't think the property is involved. But I'll find out from papa. And he's just the man to think his wife the pink of perfection." Lady Eardham had read our hero's character. Chapter 53 of Ralph the Heir by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The End of Polly Neefit. Rumours, well-supported rumours, as to the kind of life which Mr. Neefit was leading, reached Alexandra Cottage, filling Mrs. Neefit's mind with dismay, and making Polly very angry indeed. He came home always somewhat the worse for drink, and would talk of punching the heads both of Mr. Newton and of Mr. Ontario Moggs. Waddle, who was very true to his master's interests, had taken an opportunity of seeing Mrs. Neefit, and of expressing a very distinct idea that the business was going to the mischief. Mrs. Neefit was of opinion that in this emergency the business should be sold, and that they might safely remove themselves to some distant country, to Tunbridge, or perhaps to Ware. Polly, however, would not accede to her mother's views. The evil must, she thought, be cured at once. "If father goes on like this, I shall just walk straight out of the house and marry Moggs at once," Polly said. "Father makes no account of my name, and so I must just look out for my name myself." She had not as yet communicated these intentions to Ontario, but she was quite sure that she would be supported in her views by him whenever she should choose to do so. Once or twice Ontario came down to the cottage, and when he did so Mr. Neefit was always told of the visit. "I ain't going to keep anything from father, mother," Polly would say. "If he chooses to misbehave, that isn't my fault. I mean to have Mr. Moggs, and it's only natural I should like to see him." Neefit, when informed of these visits, after swearing that Moggs junior was a sneaking scoundrel to come to his house in his absence, would call upon Moggs senior, and swear with many threats that his daughter should have nothing but what she stood up in. Moggs senior would stand quite silent, cutting the skin on his hand with his shoemaker's knife, and would simply bid the infuriated breeches maker good morning when he left the shop. But in truth Mr. Moggs senior had begun to doubt. "I'd leave it a while, auntie, if I was you," he said. "Maybe, after all, he'll give her nothing." "I'll take her the first day she'll come to me, money or no money," said Moggs junior. Foiled ambition had, in truth, driven the breeches maker to madness. But there were moments in which he was softened, melancholy, and almost penitent. "Why didn't you have him when he come down to Margate?" he said, with tears running down his cheek, that very evening after eating his rump steak in Mr. Newton's rooms. The soda water and brandy, with a little gin and water after it, had reduced him to an almost maudlin condition, so that he was unable to support his parental authority. "Because I didn't choose, father. It wasn't his fault. He spoke fair enough, though I don't suppose he ever wanted it. Why should he?" "You might have had him then. He'd have never dared to go back. I'd have killed him if he had." "What good would it have done, father? He'd never have loved me, and he'd have despised you and mother." "I wouldn't have minded that," said Mr. Neefit, wiping his eyes. "But I should have minded. What should I have felt with a husband as wouldn't have wanted me ever to have my own father in his house? Would that have made me happy?" "It'd have made me happy to know as you was there." "No, father, there would have been no happiness in it. When I came to see what he was, I knew I should never love him. He was just willing to take me because of his word, and was I going to a man like that? No, father, certainly not." The poor man was at that moment too far gone in his misery to argue the matter further, and he lay on the old sofa very much at Polly's mercy. "Drop it, father," she said. "It wasn't to be, and it couldn't have been. You'd better say you'll drop it." But sick as uncomfortable as he was on that evening, he couldn't be got to say that he would drop it. Nor could he be got to drop it for some 10 days after that. But on a certain evening he had come home very uncomfortable from the effects of gin and water, and had been spoken to very sensibly both by his wife and daughter. By 7 on the following morning Ontario Moggs was sitting in the front parlour of the house at Hendon, and Polly Neefit was sitting with him. He had never been there at so early an hour before, and it was thought afterwards by both Mr. and Mrs. Neefit that his appearance so unexpected by them had not surprised their daughter Polly. Could it have been possible that she had sent a message to him after that little scene with her father? There he was at any rate, and Polly was up to receive him. "Now, auntie, that'll do. I didn't want to talk nonsense, but just to settle something." "But you'll tell a fellow that you're glad to see him." "No, I won't. I won't tell a fellow anything he doesn't know already. You and I have got to get married." "Of course we have." "But we want father's consent. I'm not going to have him made unhappy if I can help it. He's that wretched sometimes at present that my heart is half killed about him." "The things he says are monstrous," asserted Moggs, thinking of the protestation lately made by the breeches maker in his own hearing to the effect that Ralph Newton should yet be made to marry his daughter. "All the same, I've got to think about him. There's a dozen or so of men as would marry me, Mr. Moggs, but I can never have another father." "I'll be the first of the dozen, anyway," said the gallant Ontario. "That depends. However, mother says so, and if father'll consent, I won't go against it. I'll go to him now before he's up, and I'll tell him you're here. I'll bring him to his senses if I can. I don't know whatever made him think so much about gentlemen." "He didn't learn it from you, Polly." "Perhaps he did, after all, and if so, that's the more reason why I'd forgive him." So saying, Polly went upstairs upon her mission. On the landing she met her mother, and made known the fact that Ontario was in the parlour. "Don't you go to him, mother, not yet," said Polly, whereby it may be presumed that Mrs. Neefit had been informed of Mr. Moggs's visit before Polly had gone to him. Mr. Neefit was in bed, and his condition apparently was not a happy one. He was lying with his head between his hands, and was groaning, not loudly, but very bitterly. His mode of life for the last month had not been of a kind to make him comfortable, and his conscience, too, was ill at ease. He had been a hard-working man, who had loved respectability, and had been careful of his wife and child. He had been proud to think that nobody could say anything against him,
and that he had always paid his way. Up to the time of this disastrous fit of ambition on Polly's behalf, he had never made himself ridiculous, and had been a prosperous tradesman, well thought of by his customers. Suddenly he had become mad, but not so mad as to be unconscious of his own madness. The failure of his hopes, joined to the inexpressibly bitter feeling that in their joint transactions young Newton had received all that had been necessary to him, whereas he, Neefit, had got none of that for which he had bargained. These together had so upset him that he had lost his balance, had travelled out of his usual grooves, and had made an ass of himself. He knew he had made an ass of himself, and was hopelessly endeavouring to show himself to be less of an ass than people thought him, by some success in his violence. If he could only punish young Newton terribly, people would understand why he had done all this. But drink had been necessary to give him courage for his violence, and now as he lay miserable in bed his courage was very low. "Father," said Polly, "shall I give you a drink?" Neefit muttered something, and took the cold tea that was offered to him. It was cold tea, with just a spoonful of brandy in it, to make it acceptable. "Father, there ought to be an end of all this, oughtn't there?" "I don't know about no ends. I'll be down on him yet." "No, you won't, father. And why should you? He has done nothing wrong to you or me. I wouldn't have him if it was ever so." "It's all been your fault, Polly." "Yes, my fault, that I wouldn't be made what you call a lady, to be taken away so that I'd never see any more of you and mother." Then she put her hand gently on his shoulder. "I couldn't stand that, father." "I'd make him let you come to us." "A wife must obey her husband, father. Mother always obeyed you." "No, she didn't. She's again me now." "Besides, I don't want to be a lady," said Polly, seeing that she had better leave that question of marital obedience. "And I won't be a lady. I won't be better than you and mother." "You've been brought up better." "I'll show my breeding, then, by being true to you and true to the man I love. What would you think of your girl if she was to give her hand to a gentleman when she'd given her heart to a shoemaker?" "Oh, damn the shoemaker!"
"No, father, I won't have it. What is there against Ontario? He's a fine-hearted fellow as isn't greedy after money, as it kissed the very ground I stand on, he's that true to me, and is a tradesman as yourself. If we had a little place of our own, wouldn't Ontario be proud to have you there, and give you the best of everything? And wouldn't I wait upon you, just only trying to know beforehand every little as you'd like to have? And if there was to be babies, wouldn't they be brought up to love you? If I'd gone with that young man down to his fine place, do you think it would have been like that? How'd I have felt when he was too proud to let his boy know as you was my father?"
Neefit turned on his bed and groaned. He was too ill at ease as to his inner man to argue the subject from a high point of view, or to assert that he was content to be abased himself in order that his child and grandchildren might be raised in the world.
"Father," said Polly, "you have always been kind to me. Be kind to me now."
"The young uns is always to have their own way," said Neefit.
"Hasn't my way been your way, father?"
"Not when you wouldn't take the captain, when he come to Margate."
"I didn't love him, father. Dear father, say the word. We haven't been happy lately, have we, father?"
"I ain't been very happy," said Neefit, bursting out into little sobs. She put her face upon his brow and kissed it.
Father, let us be happy again. Ontario's downstairs in the parlour now."
"Ontario Moggs in my parlour!" said Neefit, jumping up in bed.
"Yes, father, Ontario Moggs, my husband as will be, the man I honour and love, the man that will honour and love you, as true a fellow as ever made a young woman happy by taking her. Let me tell him that you will have him for a son." In truth, Neefit did not speak the word, but when Polly left the room, which she presently did after a long embrace, Mr. Neefit was aware that his consent to the union would be conveyed to Ontario Moggs in less than 5 minutes. "And now you can name the day," said Ontario. "I cannot do any such thing," replied Polly, "and I think that quite enough has been settled for one morning. It's give an inch and take an ell with some folks." Ontario waited for breakfast, and had an interview with his future father-in-law. It was an hour after the scene upstairs before Mr. Neefit could descend, and when he did come down he was not very jovial at the breakfast table. "It isn't what I like, Moggs," was the first word that he spoke when the young politician rose to grasp the hand of his future father-in-law. "I hope you'll live to like it, Mr. Neefit," said Ontario, who, now that he was to have his way in regard to Polly, was prepared to disregard entirely any minor annoyances. "I don't know how that may be. I think my girl might have done better. I told her so, and I just tell you the same. She might have done a deal better. But women is always restive." "We like to have our own way about our young men, father," said Polly, who was standing behind her father's chair. "Bother young men," said the breeches maker. After that the interview passed off, if not very pleasantly, at least smoothly, and it was understood that Mr. Neefit was to abandon that system of persecution against Ralph Newton to which his life had been devoted for the last few weeks. After that there was a pretty little correspondence between Polly and Ralph, with which the story of Polly's maiden life may be presumed to be ended, and which shall be given to the reader, although by doing so the facts of our tale will be somewhat anticipated. Polly, with her father's permission, communicated the fact of her engagement to her former lover. Hendon, Saturday. Dear Sir, Father thinks it best that I should tell you that I am engaged to marry Mr. Ontario Moggs, whom you will remember. He is a most respectable tradesman, and stood once for a member of Parliament, and I think he will make me quite happy, and am quite sure that's what I'm fitted for. Whether Polly meant that she was fitted to be made happy, or fitted to be the wife of a tradesman who stood for Parliament, did not appear quite clearly. There have been things which we are very sorry for, and hope you'll forgive and forget. Father bids me say how sorry he is he broke a figure of a pretty little man in your room. He would get another, only he would not know where to go for it. Wishing you always may be happy, believe me to remain yours most respectfully, Maryanne Neefit. Ralph's answer was dated about a fortnight afterwards. Cavendish Square, 1 June, 186 . My dear Polly, I hope you will allow me to call you so now for the last time. I am indeed happy that you are going to be married. I believe Mr. Moggs to be a most excellent fellow. I hope I may often see him, and sometimes you. He must allow you to accept a little present which I send you, and never be jealous if you wear it at your waist. The pretty little man that your father broke by accident in my rooms did not signify at all. Pray tell him so from me. Believe me to be your very sincere friend, Ralph Newton. I may as well tell you my own secret. I am going to be married too.
The young lady lives in this house, and her name is Augusta Eardham." This letter was sent by messenger from Cavendish Square with a very handsome watch and chain. A month afterwards, when he was preparing to leave London for Brayborough Park, he received a little packet with a note as follows: "Linton, Devonshire, Wednesday. Dear Mr. Newton, I am so much obliged for the watch, and so is Ontario, who will never be jealous, I'm sure. It is a most beautiful thing, and I shall value it, oh, so much. I am very glad you are going to be married, and should have answered before, only I wanted to finish making, with my own hand, a little chain which I send you, and I hope your sweetheart won't be jealous either. We looked her out in a book, and found she is the daughter of a great gentleman with a title. That is all just as it should be. Ontario sends his respects. We have come down here for the honeymoon. I remain yours very sincerely, Maryanne." Chapter 54 of Ralph the Heir, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My Mary. Both the invitations sent by Patience Underwood were accepted, and Sir Thomas, on the day named, was at home to receive them. Nothing had as yet been done as to the constructing of those cases which he so suddenly ordered to be made for his books, and, indeed, Stemm had resolved to take the order as meaning nothing. It would not be for him to accelerate his master's departure from Southampton Buildings, and he knew enough of the man to be aware that he must have some very strong motive indeed before so great a change could really be made. When Sir Thomas left Southampton Buildings for Fulham on the day named for the dinner, not a word further had been said about packing the books. There was no company at the villa besides Sir Thomas, the 3 girls, and the 2 young men. As to Clarissa, Patience said not a word, even to her father. That must still be left till time should further cure the wound that had been made. But she did venture to suggest, in private with Sir Thomas, that it was a pity that he who was certainly the more worthy of the 2 Ralphs should not be made to understand that others did not think so much of the present inferiority of his position in the world as he seemed to think himself. "You mean that Mary would take him?" asked Sir Thomas. "Why should she not, if she likes him? He is very good." "I can't tell him to offer to her without telling him also that he would be accepted." "No, I suppose not," said Patience. Nevertheless, Sir Thomas did speak to Ralph Newton before dinner, stuttering and muttering, and only half finishing the sentence. "We had a correspondence once, Mr. Newton. I dare say you remember." "I remember it very well, Sir Thomas." "I only wanted to tell you. You seem to think more about what has taken place, I mean as to the property, than we do, that is, than I do." "It has made a change." "Yes, of course. But I don't know that a large place like Newton is sure to make a man happy. Perhaps you'd like to wash your hands before dinner?" Gregory in the meantime was walking round the garden with Mary and Clarissa. The dinner was very quiet, but pleasant and cheerful. Sir Thomas talked a good deal, and so did Patience. Mary also was at her ease, and able to do all that was required of her. Ralph certainly was not gay. He was seated next to Clarissa, and spoke a few words now and again, but he was arranging matters in his mind, and Patience, who was observing them all, knew that he was preoccupied. Clarissa, who now and again would forget her sorrow and revert to her former self, as she had done in the picture gallery, could not now, under the eye, as it were, of her father, her sister, and her old lover, forget her troubles. She knew what was expected of her, but she could not do it. She could not do it, at least, as yet. Nevertheless, Patience, who was the engineer in the present crisis, was, upon the whole, contented with the way in which things were going. The three girls sat with the gentlemen for a quarter of an hour after the decanters were put upon the table, and then withdrew. Sir Thomas immediately began to talk about Newton Priory, and to ask questions which might interest the parson, without, as he thought, hurting the feelings of the disinherited Ralph. This went on for about 5 minutes, during which Gregory was very eloquent about his church and his people, when suddenly Ralph rose from his chair and withdrew. "Have I said anything that annoyed him?" asked Sir Thomas anxiously. "It is not that, I think," said Gregory. Ralph walked across the passage, opened the door of the drawing-room in which the three girls were at work, walked up to the chair in which Mary Bonner was sitting, and said something in so low a voice that neither of the sisters heard him. "Certainly I will," said Mary, rising from her chair. Patience glanced round, and could see that the colour, always present in her cousin's face, was heightened, ever so little indeed, but still the tell-tale blush had told its tale. Ralph stood for a moment while Mary moved away to the door, and then followed her without speaking a word to the other girls, or bestowing a glance on either of them. "He is going to propose to her," said Clarissa, as soon as the door was shut. "No one can be sure," said Patience. "Only fancy, asking a girl to go out of the room in that brave manner. I shouldn't have gone, because I'm a coward, but it's just what Mary will like." "Let me get my hat, Mr. Newton," said Mary, taking the opportunity to trip upstairs, though her hat was hanging in the hall. When she was in her room she merely stood upright there for half a minute in the middle of the chamber, erect and stiff, with her arms and fingers stretched out, thinking how she would behave herself. Half a minute sufficed for her to find her clue, and then she came down as quickly as her feet would carry her. He had opened the front door, and was standing outside upon the gravel, and there she joined him. "I had no other way but this of speaking to you," he said. "I don't dislike coming out at all," she answered. Then there was silence for a moment or two as they walked along into the gloom of the shrubbery. "I suppose you are going down to Norfolk soon?" she said. "I do not quite know. I thought of going to morrow." "So soon as that?" "But I've got something that I want to settle. I think you must know what it is." Then he paused again, almost as though he expected her to confess that she did know. But Mary was well aware that it was not for her to say another word till he had fully explained, in the most open detail, what it was that he desired to settle. "You know a good deal of my history. When I thought that things were going well with me, much better than I had ever allowed myself to expect in early days, I became acquainted with you." Again he paused, but she had not a word to say. "I dare say you were not told, but I wrote to your uncle then, asking him whether I might have his consent just to ask you to be my wife." Again he paused, but after that he hurried on, speaking the words as quickly as he could throw them forth from his mouth. "My father died, and of course that changed everything. I told your uncle that all ground for pretension that I might have had before was cut from under me. He knew the circumstances of my birth, and I suppose that you would know it also. Then she did speak. "Yes, I did," she said. "Perhaps I was foolish to think that the property would make a difference. But the truth of it is, I have not got over the feeling, and shall never get over it. I love you with all my heart. Though it be for no good, I must tell you so." "The property can make no difference," she said. "You ought to have known that, Mr. Newton." "Ah, but it does. I tried to tell you the other day something of my present home." "Yes, I know you did, and I remember it all." "There's nothing more to be said, only to ask you to share it with me." She walked on with him in silence for a minute, but he said nothing more to press his suit, and certainly it was her turn to speak now. "I will share it with you," she said, pressing her arm upon his. "My Mary!" "Yes, your Mary, if you please." Then he took her in his arms, and pressed her to his bosom, and kissed her lips and forehead, and threw back her hat, and put his fingers among her hair. "Why did you say that the property would make a difference?" she asked in a whisper. To this he made no answer, but walked on silently, with his arm round her waist, till they came out from among the trees, and stood upon the bank of the river. "There are people in the boats. You must put your arm down," she said. "I wonder how you will like to be a farmer's wife?" he asked. "I have not an idea." "I fear so much that you will find it rough and hard." "But I have an idea about something." She took his hand and looked up into his face as she continued. "I have an idea that I shall like to be your wife." He was in a seventh heaven of happiness, and would have stood there gazing on the river with her all night if she would have allowed him. At last they walked back into the house together, and into the room where the others were assembled, with very little outward show of embarrassment. Mary was the first to enter the room, and though she blushed, she smiled also, and every one knew what had taken place. There was no secret or mystery, and in 5 minutes her cousins were congratulating her. "It's all settled for you now," said Clarissa, laughing. "Yes, it's all settled for me now, and I wouldn't have it unsettled for all the world." While this was being said in the drawing room, being said even in the presence of poor Gregory, who could not but have felt how hard it was for him to behold such bliss, Sir Thomas and Ralph had withdrawn into the opposite room. Ralph began to apologize for his own misfortunes, his misfortune in having lost the inheritance, his misfortune in being illegitimate, but Sir Thomas soon cut his apologies short. "You think a great deal more of it than she does, or than I do," said Sir Thomas. "If she does not regard it, I will never think of it again," said Ralph. "My greatest glory in what had been promised me was in thinking that it might help to win her." "You have won her without such help as that," said Sir Thomas, with his arm on the young man's shoulder. There was another delicious hour in store for him as they sat over their late tea. "Do you still think of going to Norfolk to morrow?" she said to him, with that composure which in her was so beautiful, and at the same time so expressive. "By an early train in the morning." "I thought that perhaps you might have stayed another day now." "I thought that perhaps you might want me to come back again," said Ralph, "and if so, I could make arrangements, perhaps for a week or 10 days." "Do come back," she said, "and do stay." Ralph's triumph as he returned that evening to London received Gregory's fullest sympathy. But still it must have been hard to bear. Perhaps his cousin's parting words contained for him some comfort. "Give her a little time, and she will be yours yet. I shall find it all out from Mary, and you may be sure
Chapter 55 of Ralph the Heir by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cookham. We have been obliged to anticipate in some degree the course of our story by the necessity which weighed upon us of completing the history of Polly Neefit. In regard to her we will only further express an opinion, in which we believe that we should have the concurrence of our readers, that Mr. Moggs junior had chosen well. Her story could not be adequately told without a revelation of that correspondence which, while it has explained the friendly manner in which the Neefit-Newton embarrassments were at last brought to an end, has at the same time disclosed the future lot in life of our hero, as far as a hero's lot in life may be said to depend on his marriage. Mr. Neefit had been almost heartbroken, because he was not satisfied that his victim was really punished by any of those tortures which his imagination invented and his energy executed. Even when the pretty little man was smashed, and was, in truth, smashed of malice prepense by a swinging blow from Neefit's umbrella, Neefit did not feel satisfied that he would thereby reach his victim's heart. He could project his own mind with sufficient force into the bosom of his enemy to understand that the onions and tobacco consumed in that luxurious chamber would cause annoyance. But he desired more than annoyance. He wanted to tear the very heartstrings of the young man who had, as he thought, so signally outwitted him. He did not believe that he was successful, but in truth he did make poor Ralph very unhappy. The heir felt himself to be wounded, and could not eat and drink, or walk and talk, or ride in the park, or play billiards at his club, in a manner befitting the owner of Newton Priory. He was so injured by Neefit that he became pervious to attacks which would otherwise have altogether failed in reaching him. Lady Eardham would never have prevailed against him as she did, conquering by a quick repetition of small blows, had not all his strength been annihilated for the time by the persecutions of the breeches-maker. Lady Eardham whispered to him as he was taking his departure on the evening of the dinner in Cavendish Square. "Dear Mr. Newton, just one word," she said confidentially. "That must be a very horrid man," alluding to Mr. Neefit. "It's a horrid bore, you know, Lady Eardham." "Just so, and it makes me feel as though I didn't quite know whether something ought not to be done. Would you mind calling at 11 to-morrow? Of course I shan't tell Sir George, unless you think he ought to be told." Ralph promised that he would call, though he felt at the moment that Lady Eardham was an interfering old fool. Why should she want to do anything, and why should she give even a hint as to telling Sir George? As he walked across Hanover Square and down Bond Street to his rooms, he did assert to himself plainly that the old harridan, as he called her, was at work for her second girl, and he shook his head and winked his eye as he thought of it. But even in his solitude he did not feel strong against Lady Eardham, and he moved along the pavement oppressed by a half-formed conviction that her ladyship would prevail against him. He did not, however, think that he had any particular objection to Gus Eardham. There was a deal of style about the girl, a merit in which either Clarissa or Mary would have been sadly deficient. And there could be no doubt in this, that a man in his position ought to marry in his own class. The proper thing for him to do was to make the daughter of some country gentleman, or of some nobleman, just as it might happen, mistress of the Priory. Dear little Clary would hardly have known how to take her place properly down in Hampshire. And then he thought for a moment of Polly. Perhaps, after all, fate, fashion, and fortune managed marriage for young men better than they could manage it for themselves. What a life would his have been had he really married Polly Neefit! Though he did call Lady Eardham a harridan, he resolved that he would keep his promise for the following morning. Lady Eardham, when he arrived, was mysterious, eulogistic, and beneficent. She was clearly of opinion that something should be done. "You know it is so horrid having these kind of things said." And yet she was almost equally strong in opinion that nothing could be done. "You know I wouldn't have my girl's name brought up for all the world, though why the horrid wretch should have named her I cannot even guess." The horrid wretch had not in truth named any special her, though it suited Lady Eardham to presume that allusion had been made to that hope of the flock, that crowning glory of the Eardham family, that most graceful of the Graces, that Venus certain to be chosen by any Paris, her second daughter, Gus. She went on to explain that were she to tell the story to her son Marmaduke, her son Marmaduke would probably kill the breeches maker. As Marmaduke Eardham was, of all young men about town, perhaps the most careless, the most indifferent, and the least ferocious, his mother was probably mistaken in her estimate of his resentful feelings. As for Sir George, he would be for taking the law of the wretch for libel, and then we should be, I don't know where we should be then, but my dear girl would die. Of course there was nothing done. During the whole interview Lady Eardham continued to press Neefit's letter under her hand upon the table, as though it was of all documents the most precious. She handled it as though to tear it would be as bad as to tear an original document bearing the King's signature. Before the interview was over she had locked it up in her desk, as though there were something in it by which the whole Eardham race might be blessed or banned. And, though she spoke no such word, she certainly gave Ralph to understand that by this letter he, Ralph Newton, was in some mysterious manner so connected with the secrets and the interests and the sanctity of the Eardham family, that whether such connection might be for weal or woe, the Newtons and the Eardhams could never altogether free themselves from the link. "Perhaps you had better come and dine with us in a family way to-morrow," said Lady Eardham, giving her invitation as though it must necessarily be tendered and almost necessarily accepted. Ralph, not thanking her, but taking it in the same spirit, said that he would be there at 7:30. "Just ourselves," said Lady Eardham in a melancholy tone, as though they two were doomed to eat family dinners together for ever after. "I suppose the property is really his own?" said Lady Eardham to her husband that afternoon. Sir George was a stout, plethoric gentleman with a short temper and many troubles. Marmaduke was expensive, and Sir George himself had spent money when he was young. The girls, who knew that they had no fortunes, expected that everything should be done for them, at least during the period of their natural harvest, and they were successful in having their expectations realized. They demanded that there should be horses to ride, servants to attend them, and dresses to wear, and they had horses, servants, and dresses. There were also younger children, and Sir George was quite as anxious as Lady Eardham that his daughters should become wives. "His own? Of course it's his own. Who else should it belong to?" "There was something about that other young man." "That bastard! It was the greatest sin that ever was thought of, to palm such a fellow as that off on the county. But it didn't come to anything." "I'm told, too, he has been very extravagant. No doubt he did get money from the tailor who wants to make him marry his daughter." "A flea-bite," said Sir George. "Don't you bother about that." Thus authorised, Lady Eardham went to the work with a clear conscience and a good will.
On the next morning Ralph received by post an envelope from Sir Thomas Underwood, containing a letter addressed to him from Mr. Neefit. Sir, are you going to make your ward act honourable to me and my daughter? Yours respectful, Thomas Neefit. The reader will understand that this was prior to Polly's triumph over her father. Ralph uttered a deep curse, and made up his mind that he must either throw himself entirely among the Eardhams, or else start at once for the Rocky Mountains. He dined in Cavendish Square that day, and again took Gus down to dinner. "I'm very glad to see you here," said Sir George, when they two were alone together after the ladies had left them. Sir George, who had been pressed upon home service because of the necessity of the occasion, was anxious to get off to his club. "You are very kind, Sir George," said Ralph. "We shall be delighted to see you at Brayboro', if you'll come for a week in September, and look at the girls' horses. They say you're quite a pundit about horseflesh." "Oh, I don't know," said Ralph. "You'll like to go up to the girls now, I dare say, and I've got an engagement." Then Sir George rang the bell for a cab, and Ralph went upstairs to the girls. Emily had taken herself away. Josephine was playing bézique with her mother, and Gus was thus forced into conversation with the young man. "Bézique is so stupid," said Gus. "Horribly stupid," said Ralph. "And what do you like, Mr. Newton?" "I like you," said Ralph. But he did not propose on that evening. Lady Eardham thought he ought to have done so, and was angry with him. It was becoming almost a matter of necessity with her that young men should not take much time. Emily was 27, and Josephine was a most difficult child to manage, not pretty, but yet giving herself airs, and expecting everything. She had refused a clergyman with a very good private fortune, greatly to her mother's sorrow, and Gus had already been the source of much weary labour. 4 eldest sons had been brought to her feet, and been allowed to slip away, and all, as Lady Eardham said, because Gus would joke with other young men, while the one man should have received all her pleasantry. Emily was quite of opinion that young Newton should by no means have been allotted to Gus. Lady Eardham, who had played bézique with an energy against which Josephine would have mutinied but that some promise was made as to Marshall and Snelgrove, could see from her little table that young Newton was neither abject nor triumphant in his manner. He had not received, nor had he even asked, when he got up to take his leave. Lady Eardham could have boxed his ears, but she smiled upon him ineffably, pressed his hand, and in the most natural way in the world alluded to some former allusion about riding and the park. "I shan't ride to morrow," said Gus, with her back turned to them. "Do," said Ralph. "No, I shan't." "You see what she says, Lady Eardham," said Ralph. "You promised you would before dinner, my dear," said Lady Eardham, "and you ought not to change your mind. If you'll be good-natured enough to come, 2 of them will go." Of course it was understood that he would come. "Nothing on earth, mamma, shall ever induce me to play bézique again," said Josephine, yawning. "It's not worse for you than for me," said the old lady, sharply. "But it isn't fair," said Josephine, who was supposed to be the clever one of the family. "I may have to play my bézique a quarter of a century hence." "He's an insufferable puppy," said Emily, who had come into the room, and had been pretending to be reading. "That's because he don't bark at your bidding, my dear," said Gus. "It doesn't seem that he means to bark at yours," said the elder sister. "If you go on like that, girls, I'll tell your papa, and we'll go to Brayboro' at once. It's too bad, and I won't bear it." "What would you have me do?" said Gus, standing up for herself fiercely. Gus did ride, and so did Josephine, and there was a servant with them, of course. It had been Emily's turn, there being 2 horses for the 3 girls, but Gus had declared that no good would come if Emily went, and Emily's going had been stopped by parental authority. "You are to do as you're bid," said Sir George, "or you'll get the worst of it." Sir George suffered much from gout, and had obtained from the ill temper which his pangs produced a mastery over his daughters which some fathers might have envied. "You behaved badly to me last night, Mr. Newton," said Gus on horseback. There was another young man riding with Josephine, so that the lovers were alone together. "Behaved badly to you?" "Yes, you did, and I felt it very much indeed." "How did I behave badly?" "If you do not know, I'm sure that I shall not tell you." Ralph did not know, but he went home from his ride an unengaged man, and may perhaps have been thought to behave badly on that occasion also. But Lady Eardham, though she was sometimes despondent and often cross, was gifted with perseverance. A picnic party up the river from Maidenhead to Cookham was got up for the 30th of May, and Ralph Newton of course was there. Just at that time the Neefit persecution was at its worst. Letters directed by various hands came to him daily, and in all of them he was asked when he meant to be on the square. He knew the meaning of that picnic as well as does the reader, as well as did Lady Eardham. But it had come to that with him that he was willing to yield. It cannot exactly be said for him that out of all the feminine worth that he had seen, he himself had chosen Gus Eardham as being the most worthy, or even that he had chosen her as being to him the most charming. But it was evident to him that he must get married, and why not to her as well as to another? She had style, plenty of style, and, as he told himself, style for a man in his position was more than anything else. It can hardly be said that he had made up his mind to offer to her before he started for Cookham, though doubtless through all the remaining years of his life he would think that his mind had been so fixed. But he had concluded that if she were thrown at his head very hard, he might as well take her. "I don't think he ever does drink champagne," said Lady Eardham, talking it all over with Gus on the morning of the picnic. At Cookham there is, or was, a punt, perhaps there always will be one, kept there for such purposes, and into this punt either Gus was tempted by Ralph, or Ralph by Gus. "My darling child, what are you doing?" shouted Lady Eardham from the bank. "Mr. Newton says he can take me over," said Gus, standing up in the punt, shaking herself with a pretty tremor. "Don't, Mr. Newton, pray don't," cried Lady Eardham with affected horror. Lunch was over, or dinner, as it might be more properly called, and Ralph had taken a glass or two of champagne. He was a man whom no one had ever seen the worse for wine, but on this occasion that which might have made others drunk had made him bold. "I will not let you out, Gus, till you have promised me one thing," said Ralph. "What is the one thing?" "That you will go with me everywhere, always." "You must let me out," said Gus. "But will you promise?" Then Gus promised, and Lady Eardham, with true triumph in her voice, was able to tell her husband on the following morning that the cost of the picnic had not been thrown away. On the next morning early Ralph was in the square. Neither when he went to bed at night, nor when he got up in the morning, did he regret what he had done. The marriage would be quite a proper marriage. Nobody could say that he had been mercenary, and he hated a mercenary feeling in marriages. Nobody could say that the match was beneath him, and all people were agreed that Augusta Eardham was a very fine girl. As to her style, there could be no doubt about it. There might be some little unpleasantness in communicating the fact to the Underwoods,
but that could be done by letter. After all, it would signify very little to him what Sir Thomas thought about him. Sir Thomas might think him feeble, but he himself knew very well that there had been no feebleness in it. His circumstances had been very peculiar, and he really believed that he had made the best of them. As Squire of Newton he was doing quite the proper thing in marrying the daughter of a baronet out of the next county. With a light heart, a pleased face, and with very well got up morning apparel, Ralph knocked the next morning at the door in Cavendish Square, and asked for Sir George Eardham. "I'll just run upstairs for a second," said Ralph, when he was told that Sir George was in the small parlour. He did run upstairs, and in 3 minutes had been kissed by Lady Eardham and all her daughters. At this moment Gus was the dearest child, and the best love of a thing, with all of them. Even Emily remembered how pleasant it might be to have a room at Newton Priory, and then success always gives a new charm. "Have you seen Sir George?" asked Lady Eardham. "Not as yet. They said he was there, but I had to come up and see her first, you know." "Go down to him," said Lady Eardham, patting her prey on the back twice. "When you've daughters of your own, you'll expect to be consulted." "She couldn't have done better, my dear fellow," said Sir George, with a kind, genial cordiality. "She couldn't have done better, to my thinking, even with a peerage. I like you, and I like your family, and I like your property, and she's yours with all my heart. A better girl never lived. Thank you, Sir George. She has no money, you know." "I don't care about money, Sir George." "My dear boy, she's yours with all my heart, and I hope you'll make
Chapter 56 of Ralph the Heir, by Anthony Trollope. This recording is in the public domain. Ralph Newton is bowled away. A day or two after his engagement, Ralph did write his letter to Sir Thomas, and found when the moment came that the task was difficult. But he wrote it. The thing had to be done, and there was nothing to be gained by postponing it. Club, June 2nd, 186 . My dear Sir Thomas, you will, I hope, be glad to hear that I am engaged to be married to Augusta Eardham, the second daughter of Sir George Eardham, of Brayborough Park, in Berkshire. Of course you will know the name, and I rather think you were in the House when Sir George sat for Berkshire. Augusta has got no money, but I have not been placed under the disagreeable necessity of looking out for a rich wife. I believe we shall be married about the end of August. As the ceremony will take place down at Brayborough, I fear that I cannot expect that you or Patience and Clarissa should come so far. Pray tell them my news, with my best love. Yours, most grateful for all your long kindness, Ralph Newton. I am very sorry that you should have been troubled by letters from Mr. Neefit. The matter has been arranged at last. The letter, when done, was very simple, but it took him some time and much consideration. Should he or should he not allude to his former loves? It was certainly much easier to write his letter without any such allusion, and he did so. About a week after this, Sir Thomas went home to Fulham and took the letter with him. "Clary," he said, taking his youngest daughter affectionately by the waist, when he found himself alone with her, "I've got a piece of news for you." "For me, papa?" "Well, for all of us. Somebody is going to be married. Who do you think it is?" "Not Ralph Newton?" said Clarissa, with a little start. "Yes, Ralph Newton."
"How quick he arranges things," said Clarissa. There was some little emotion, just a quiver and a quick rush of blood into her cheeks, which, however, left them just as quickly. "Yes, he is quick." "Who is it, papa?" "A very proper sort of person, the daughter of a Berkshire baronet." "But what is her name?" "Augusta Eardham." "Augusta Eardham. I hope he'll be happy, papa. We've known him a long time." "I think he will be happy, what people call happy. He is not gifted, or cursed, as it may be, with fine feelings, and is what perhaps may be called thick-skinned, but he will love his own wife and children. I don't think he will be a spendthrift, now that he has plenty to spend, and he is not subject to what the world calls vices. I shouldn't wonder if he becomes a prosperous and most respectable country gentleman, and quite a model to his neighbours." "It doesn't seem to matter much, does it?" said Clarissa, when she told the story to Mary and Patience. "What doesn't matter?" asked Mary. "Whether a man cares for the girl he's going to marry, or doesn't care at all. Ralph Newton cannot care very much for Miss Eardham." "I think it matters very much," said Mary. "Perhaps after all he'll be just as fond of his wife as though he had been making love to her, oh, for years," said Clarissa. This was nearly all that was said at the villa, though no doubt poor Clary had many thoughts on the matter in her solitary rambles along the river. That picture of the youth as he lay upon the lawn, looking up into her eyes and telling her that she was dear to him, could not easily be effaced from her memory. Sir Thomas, before this, had written his congratulations to Ralph. They had been very short, and in them no allusion had been made to the young ladies at Popham Villa. In the meantime Ralph was as happy as the day was long, and delighted with his lot in life. For some weeks previous to his offer he had been aware that Lady Eardham had been angling for him as for a fish, that he had been as a prey to her and to her daughter, and that it behoved him to amuse himself without really taking the hook between his gills. He had taken the hook, and now had totally forgotten all those former notions of his in regard to a prey, and a fish, and a mercenary old harridan of a mother. He had no sooner been kissed all round by the women, and paternally blessed by Sir George, than he thought that he had exercised a sound judgment, and had with true wisdom arranged to ally himself with just the woman most fit to be his wife, and the future mistress of Newton Priory. He was proud, indeed, of his success when he read the paragraph in the Morning Post, announcing as a fact that the alliance had been arranged, and was again able to walk about among his comrades as one of those who make circumstances subject to them, rather than become subject to circumstances. His comrades no doubt saw the matter in another light. "By Jove," said Pretty Poll at his club, "there's Newton been and got caught by old Eardham after all. The girl has been running 10 years, and been hawked about like a second-class racehorse." "Yes, poor fellow," said Captain Fooks. "Neefit has done that for him. Ralph for a while was so knocked off his pins by the breeches maker that he didn't know where to look for shelter." Whether marriages should be made in heaven or on earth must be a matter of doubt to observers, whether, that is, men and women are best married by chance, which I take to be the real fashion of heaven-made marriages, or should be brought into that close link and loving bondage to each other by thought, selection, and decision. That the heavenly mode prevails the oftenest there can hardly be a doubt. It takes years to make a friendship, but a marriage may be settled in a week, in an hour.
If you desire to go into partnership with a man in business, it is an essential necessity that you should know your partner, that he be honest or dishonest, if such be your own tendency, industrious, instructed in the skill required, and of habits of life fit for the work to be done. But into partnerships for life, of a kind much closer than any business partnership, men rush without any preliminary inquiries. Some investigation and anxiety as to means there may be, though in this respect the ordinary parlance of the world endows men with much more caution, or accuses them of more greed than they really possess. But in other respects everything is taken for granted. Let the woman, if possible, be pretty, or if not pretty, let her have style. Let the man, if possible, not be a fool, or if a fool, let him not show his folly too plainly. As for knowledge of character, none is possessed and none is wanted. The young people meet each other in their holiday dresses, on holiday occasions, amidst holiday pleasures, and the thing is arranged. Such matches may be said to be heaven-made. It is a fair question whether they do not answer better than those which have less of chance, or less of heaven, in their manufacture. If it be needful that a man and woman take 5 years to learn whether they will suit each other as husband and wife, and that then, at the end of the 5 years, they find that they will not suit, the freshness of the flower would be gone before it could be worn in the buttonhole. There are some leaps which you must take in the dark, if you mean to jump at all. We can all understand well that a wise man should stand on the brink and hesitate, but we can understand also that a very wise man should declare to himself that with no possible amount of hesitation could certainty be achieved. Let him take the jump or not take it, but let him not presume to think that he can so jump as to land himself in certain bliss. It is clearly God's intention that men and women should live together, and therefore let the leap in the dark be made. No doubt there had been very much of heaven in Ralph Newton's last choice. It may be acknowledged that in lieu of choosing at all, he had left the matter altogether to heaven. Some attempt he had made at choosing, in reference to Mary Bonner, but he had found the attempt simply to be troublesome and futile. He had spoken soft, loving words to Clarissa because she herself had been soft and lovable. Nature had spoken, as she does when the birds sing to each other. Then again, while suffering under pecuniary distress, he had endeavoured to make himself believe that Polly Neefit was just the wife for him. Then, amidst the glories of his emancipation from thraldom, he had seen Mary Bonner, and had actually, after a fashion, made a choice for himself. His choice had brought upon him nothing but disgrace and trouble. Now he had succeeded at the bidding of heaven and Lady Eardham, and he was about to be provided with a wife exactly suited for him. It may be said at the same time that Augusta Eardham was equally lucky. She also had got all that she ought to have wanted, had she known what to want. They were, both of them, incapable of what men and women call love, when they speak of love as a passion linked with romance, and in one sense they were cold-hearted. Neither of them was endowed with the privilege of pining because another person had perished, but each of them was able to love a mate when assured that that mate must continue to be a mate, unless separation should come by domestic earthquake. They had hearts enough for paternal and maternal duties, and would probably agree in thinking that any geese which Providence might send them were veritable swans. Bickerings there might be, but they would be bickerings without effect. And Ralph Newton of Newton would probably so live with this wife of his bosom that they two might lie at last pleasantly together in the family vault, with a record of their homely virtues visible to the survivors of the parish on the same tombstone. The means by which each of them would have arrived at these blessings would not redound to the credit of either, but the blessings would be there, and it may be said of their marriage, as of many such marriages, that it was made in heaven, and was heavenly. The marriage was to take place early in September, and the first week in August was passed by Sir George and Lady Eardham and their 2 younger daughters at Newton Priory. On the 14th Ralph was to be allowed to run down to the moors just for 1 week, and then he was to be back, passing between Newton and Brayboro', signing deeds and settlements, preparing for their wedding tour, and obedient in all things to Eardham influences. It did occur to him that it would be proper that he should go down to Fulham to see his old friends once before his marriage, but he felt that such a visit would be to himself very unpleasant, and therefore he assured himself, and moreover made himself believe, that if he abstained from the visit he would abstain because it would be unpleasant to them. He did abstain, but he did call at the chambers in Southampton Buildings. He called, however, at an hour in which he knew that Sir Thomas would not be visible, and made no second pressing request to Stemm for the privilege of entrance. He had great pride in showing his house and park and estate to the Eardhams, and had some delicious rambles with his Augusta through the shrubberies and down by the little brook. Ralph had an enjoyment in the prettiness of nature, and Augusta was clever enough to simulate the feeling. He was a little annoyed, perhaps, when he found that the beauty of her morning dresses did not admit of her sitting upon the grass or leaning against gates, and once expressed an opinion that she need not be so particular about her gloves in this the hour of their billing and cooing. Augusta altogether declined to remove her gloves in a place swarming, as she said, with midges, or to undergo any kind of embrace while adorned with that sweetest of all hats, which had been purchased for his special delight. But in other respects she was good-humoured, and tried to please him. She learned the names of all his horses, and was beginning to remember those of his tenants. She smiled upon Gregory, and behaved with a pretty decorum when the young parson showed her his church. Altogether her behaviour was much better than might have been expected from the training to which she had been subjected during her 7 seasons in London. Lord Polperrow wronged her greatly when he said that she had been running for 10 years. There was a little embarrassment in Ralph's first interview with Gregory. He had given his brother notice of his engagement by letter as soon as he had been accepted, feeling that any annoyance coming to him might be lessened in that way. Unfortunately he had spoken to his brother in what he now felt to have been exaggerated terms of his passion for Mary Bonner, and he himself was aware that that malady had been quickly cured. "I suppose the news startled you?" he had said, with a forced laugh, as soon as he met his brother. "Well, yes, a little. I did not know that you were so intimate with them." "The truth is, I had thought a deal about the matter, and I had come to see how essential it was for the interests of us all that I should marry into our own set. The moment I saw Augusta I felt she was exactly the girl to make me happy. She is very handsome, don't you think so?" "Certainly." "And then she has just the style, which, after all, does go so far. There's nothing dowdy about her. A dowdy woman would have killed me. She attracted me from the first moment, and by Jove, old fellow, I can assure you it was mutual. I am the happiest fellow alive, and I don't think there is anything I envy anybody." In all this Ralph believed that he was speaking the simple truth. "I hope you will be happy with all my heart," said Gregory. "I'm sure I shall, and so will you if you will ask that little puss once again. I believe in my heart she loves you." Gregory, though he had been informed of his brother's passion for Mary, had never been told of that other passion for Clarissa, and Ralph could therefore speak of ground for hope in that direction without uncomfortable twinges. There did occur during this fortnight one or two little matters just sufficiently laden with care to ruffle the rose leaves of our hero's couch. Lady Eardham thought that both the dining room and drawing room should be refurnished, that a bow window should be thrown out to the breakfast parlour, and that a raised conservatory should be constructed into which Augusta's own morning sitting room upstairs might be made to open. Ralph gave way about the furniture with a good grace, but he thought that the bow window would disfigure the house, and suggested that the raised conservatory would cost money. Augusta thought the bow window was the very thing for the house, and Lady Eardham knew as a fact that a similar conservatory, the sweetest thing in the world, which she had seen at Lord Rosebud's, had cost almost absolutely nothing. And if anything was well known in gardening, it was this, that the erection of such conservatories was a positive saving in garden expenses. The men worked under cover during the rainy days, and the hot water served for domestic as well as horticultural purposes. There was some debate and a little heat, and the matter was at last referred to Sir George. He voted against Ralph on both points, and the orders were given. Then there was the more important question of the settlements. Of course there were to be settlements, in the arrangement of which Ralph was to give everything and to get nothing. With high-handed magnanimity he had declared that he wanted no money, and therefore the trifle which would have been adjudged to be due to Gus was retained to help her as yet less fortunate sisters. In truth, Marmaduke at this time was so expensive that Sir George was obliged to be a little hard. Why, however, he should have demanded out of such a property as that of Newton a jointure of £4,000 a year, with a house to be found either in town or country, as the widow might desire, on behalf of a penniless girl, no one acting in the Newton interest could understand, unless Sir George might have thought that the sum to be ultimately obtained might depend in some degree on that demanded. Had he known Mr. Carey, he would probably not have subjected himself to the rebuke which he received. Ralph, when the sum was first named to him by Sir George's lawyer, who came down purposely to Newton, looked very blank, and said that he had not anticipated any arrangement so destructive to the property. The lawyer pointed out that there was unfortunately no dowager's house provided, that the property would not be destroyed, as the dower would only be an annuity, that ladies now were more liberally treated in this matter than formerly, that the suggestion was quite the usual thing. "You don't suppose I mean my daughter to be starved?" said Sir George, upon whom gout was then coming. Ralph plucked up spirit and answered him. "Nor do I intend that your daughter, sir, should be starved." "Dear Ralph, do be liberal to the dear girl," said Lady Eardham afterwards, caressing our hero in the solitude of her bedroom. Mr. Carey, however, arranged the whole matter very quickly. The dower must be £2,000, out of which the widow must find her own house. Sir George must be well aware, said Mr. Carey, that the demand made was preposterous. Sir George said one or two very nasty things, but the dower as fixed by Mr. Carey was accepted, and then everything smiled again. When the Eardhams were leaving Newton, the parting between Augusta and her lover was quite pretty. "Dear Gus," he said, "when next I am here you will be my own wife," and he kissed her. "Dear Ralph," she said,
"When next I am here you will be my own husband," and kissed him. "But we have Como and Florence and Rome and Naples to do before that, and won't that be nice?" "It will be very nice to be anywhere with you," said the lover. "And mind you have your coat made just as I told you," said Augusta. So they parted. Early in September they were married with great éclat at Brayboro', and Lady Eardham spared nothing on the occasion. It was her first maternal triumph, and all the country round was made to know of her success. The Newtons had been at Newton for she did not know how many 100 years. In her zeal she declared that the estate had been in the same hands for long before the Conquest. "There's no title," she said to her intimate friend Lady Whigham, "but there's that which is better than a title. We're mushrooms to the Newtons, you know. We only came into Berkshire in the reign of Henry VIII." As the Whighams had only come into Buckinghamshire in the reign of George IV., Lady Whigham, had she known the facts, would probably have reminded her dear friend that the Eardhams had in truth first been heard of in those parts in the time of Queen Anne, the original Eardham having made his money in following Marlborough's army. But Lady Whigham had not studied the history of the county gentry. The wedding went off very well, and the bride and bridegroom were bowled away to the nearest station with 4 grey post horses from Reading, in a manner that was truly delightful to Lady Eardham's motherly feelings. And with the same grey horses shall the happy bride and bridegroom be bowled out of our sight also. The writer of this story feels that some apology is due to his readers for having endeavoured to entertain them so long with the adventures of one of whom it certainly cannot be said that he was fit to be delineated as a hero. It is thought by many critics that in the pictures of imaginary life which novelists produce for the amusement, and possibly for the instruction, of their readers, none should be put upon the canvas but the very good, who by their noble thoughts and deeds may lead others to nobility, or the very bad, who by their declared wickedness will make iniquity hideous. How can it be worth one's while, such critics will say. The writer here speaks of all critical readers, and not of professional critics. How can it be worth our while to waste our imaginations, our sympathies, and our time upon such a one as Ralph, the heir of the Newton property? The writer, acknowledging the force of these objections, and confessing that his young heroes of romance are but seldom heroic, makes his apology as follows. The reader of a novel, who has doubtless taken the volume up simply for amusement, and who would probably lay it down did he suspect that instruction, like a snake in the grass, like physic beneath the sugar, was to be imposed upon him, requires from his author chiefly this, that he shall be amused by a narrative in which elevated sentiment prevails, and gratified by being made to feel that the elevated sentiments described are exactly his own. When the heroine is nobly true to her lover, to her friend, or to her duty, through all persecution, the girl who reads declares to herself that she also would have been a Jeannie Deans had fate and fortune given her an Effie as a sister. The bald-headed old lawyer, for bald-headed old lawyers do read novels, who interests himself in the high-minded, self-devoting chivalry of a Colonel Newcombe, believes he would have acted as the colonel had he been so tried. What youth in his imagination cannot be as brave and as loving, though as hopeless in his love, as Harry Esmond? Alas, no one will wish to be as was Ralph Newton. But for one Harry Esmond there are 50 Ralph Newtons, 550 of them,
and the very youth whose bosom glows with admiration as he reads of Harry, who exults in the idea that as Harry did, so would he have done, lives as Ralph lived, is less noble, less persistent, less of a man even than was Ralph Newton. It is the test of a novel writer's art that he conceals his snake in the grass, that the reader may be sure that it is always there. No man or woman with a conscience, no man or woman with intellect sufficient to produce amusement, can go on from year to year spinning stories without the desire of teaching, with no ambition of influencing readers for their good. Gentle readers, the physic is always beneath the sugar, hidden or unhidden. In writing novels, we novelists preach to you from our pulpits, and are keenly anxious that our sermons shall not be inefficacious. Inefficacious they are not, unless they be too badly preached to obtain attention. Injurious they will be, unless the lessons taught be good lessons. What a world this would be if every man were a Harry Esmond, or every woman a Jeannie Deans! But then again, what a world if every woman were a Becky Sharp, and every man a Varney or a Barry Lyndon! Of Varneys and Harry Esmonds there are very few. Human nature, such as it is, does not often produce them. The portraits of such virtues and such vices serve no doubt to emulate and to deter. But are no other portraits necessary? Should we not be taught to see the men and women among whom we really live, men and women such as we are ourselves, in order that we should know what are the exact failings which oppress ourselves, and thus learn to hate, and if possible to avoid in life, the faults of character which in life are hardly visible, but which in portraiture of life can be made to be so transparent. Ralph Newton did nothing, gentle reader, which would have caused thee greatly to grieve for him, nothing certainly which would have caused thee to repudiate him, had he been thy brother. And, gentlest, sweetest reader, had he come to thee as thy lover, with sufficient protest of love, and with all his history written in his hand, would that have caused thee to reject his suit? Had he been thy neighbour, thou well-to-do reader, with a house in the country, would he not have been welcome to thy table? Wouldst thou have avoided him at his club, thou reader from the West End? Has he not settled himself respectably, thou grey-haired, novel-reading paterfamilias, thou materfamilias, with daughters of thine own to be married? In life would he have been held to have disgraced himself, except in the very moment in which he seemed to be in danger? Nevertheless, the faults of a Ralph Newton, and not the vices of a Varney or a Barry Lyndon, are the evils against which men should in these days be taught to guard themselves, which women also should be made to hate. Such is the writer's apology for his very indifferent hero. Chapter 57 of Ralph the Heir by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Clarissa's Fate. In the following October, while Newton of Newton and his bride were making themselves happy amidst the glories of Florence, she with her finery from Paris, and he with a newly acquired taste for Michael Angelo and the fine arts generally, Gregory the parson again went up to London. He had, of course, assisted at his brother's marriage, in which the heavy burden of the ceremony was imposed on the shoulders of a venerable dean who was related to Lady Eardham, and had since that time been all alone at his parsonage. Occasionally he had heard of the Underwoods from Ralph Newton of Beamingham, whose wedding had been postponed till Beamingham Hall had been made fit for its mistress. And from what he had heard, Gregory was induced, hardly to hope, but to dream it to be possible that even yet he might prevail in love. An idea had grown upon him, springing from various sources, that Clarissa had not been indifferent to his brother, and that this feeling on her part had marred, and must continue to mar, his own happiness. He never believed that there had been fault on his brother's part, but still, if Clarissa had been so wounded, he could hardly hope, and perhaps should not even wish, that she would consent to share with him his parsonage in the close neighbourhood of his brother's house. During all that September he told himself that the thing should be over, and he began to try to teach himself, that celibacy was the state in which a clergyman might best live and do his duty. But the lesson had not gone far with him before he shook himself, and determined that he would try yet once again. If there had been such a wound, why should not the wound be cured? Clarissa was at any rate true. She would not falsely promise him a heart when it was beyond her power to give it. In October, therefore, he went again up to London. The cases for packing the books had not even yet been made, and Sir Thomas was found in Southampton Buildings. The first words had, of course, reference to the absent squire. The squire of one's parish, the head of one's family, and one's elder brother, when the three are united in the same personage, will become important to one, even though the personage himself be not heroic. Ralph had written home twice, and everything was prospering with him. Sir Thomas, who had become tired of his late ward, and who had thought worse of the Eardham marriage than the thing deserved, was indifferent to the joys of the Italian honeymoon. "They'll do very well, no doubt," said Sir Thomas. "I was delighted to learn that Augusta bore her journey so well," said Gregory. "Augustas always do bear their journeys well," said Sir Thomas, "though sometimes I fancy they find the days a little too long." But his tone was very different when Gregory asked his leave to make one more attempt at Popham Villa. "I only hope you may succeed, for her sake as well as for your own," said Sir Thomas. But when he was asked as to the parson's chance of success, he declared that he could say nothing. "She is changed, I think, from what she used to be, is more thoughtful, perhaps, and less giddy. It may be that such change will turn her towards you." "I would not have her changed in anything," said Gregory, "except in her feelings towards myself." He had been there twice or thrice before he found what he thought to be an opportunity fit for the work that he had on hand. And yet both Patience and Mary did for him and for her all that they knew how to do. But in such a matter it is so hard to act without seeming to act. She who can manoeuvre on such a field without displaying her manoeuvres is indeed a general. No man need ever attempt the execution of a task so delicate. Mary and Patience put their heads together and resolved that they would say nothing, nor did they manifestly take steps to leave the two alone. It was a question with them, especially with Patience, whether the lover had not come too soon. But Clarissa at last attacked her sister. "Patience," she said, "why do you not speak to me?" "Not speak to you, Clary?" "Not a word about that which is always on my mind. You have not mentioned Ralph Newton's name once since his marriage." "I have thought it better not to mention it. Why should I mention it?" "If you think that it would pain me, you are mistaken. It pains me more that you should think that I could not bear it.
He was welcome to his wife." "I know you wish him well, Clary." "Well? Oh yes, I wish him well. No doubt he will be happy with her. She is fit for him, and I was not. He did quite right." "He is not half so good as his brother," said Patience. "Certainly he is not so good as his brother. Men, of course, will be different. But it is not always the best man that one likes the best. It ought to be so, perhaps." "I know which I like the best," said Patience. "Oh, Clary, if you could but bring yourself to love him!" "How is one to change like that? And I do not know that he cares for me now." "Ah, I think he cares for you." "Why should he? Is a man to be sacrificed for always because a girl will not take him? His heart is changed. He takes care to show me so when he comes here. I am glad that it should be changed. Dear Patty, if papa would but come and live at home, I should want nothing else." "I want something else," said Patience. "I want nothing but that you should love me, and that papa should be with us. But, Patty, do not make me feel that you are afraid to speak to me." On the day following Gregory was again at Fulham, and he had come thither fully determined that he would now for the last time ask that question, on the answer to which, as it now seemed to him, all his future happiness must depend. He had told himself that he would shake off this too human longing for a sweet face to be ever present with him at his board, for a sweet heart to cherish him with its love, for a dear head to lie upon his bosom. But he had owned to himself that it could not be shaken off, and having so owned, was more sick than ever with desire. Mary and Clarissa were both out when he arrived, and he was closeted for a while with Patience. "How tired you must be of seeing me," he said. "Tired of seeing you? Oh, no." "I feel myself to be going about like a phantom, and I am ashamed of myself. My brother is successful and happy, and has all that he desires." "He is easily satisfied," said Patience, with something of sarcasm in her voice. "And my cousin Ralph is happy and triumphant. I ought not to pine, but in truth I am so weak that I am always pining. Tell me at once, is there a chance for me?" Did it occur to him to think that she to whom he was speaking ever asked herself why it was not given to her to have even a hope of that joy for which he was craving? Did she ever pine because, when others were mating round her, flying off in pairs to their warm mutual nests, there came to her no such question of mating and flying off to love and happiness? If there was such pining, it was all inward, hidden from her friends, so that their mirth should not be lessened by her want of mirth, not expressed either by her eye or mouth, because she knew that on the expression of her face depended somewhat of the comfort of those who loved her. A homely brow, and plain features, and locks of hair that have not been combed by love's attendant nymphs into soft and winning tresses, seems to tell us that love is not wanted by the bosom that owns them. We teach ourselves to regard such a one, let her be ever so good, with ever so sweet a temper, ever so generous in heart, ever so affectionate among her friends, as separated alike from the perils and the privileges of that passion, without which they who are blessed or banned with beauty would regard life but as a charred and mutilated existence. It is as though we should believe that passion springs from the rind, which is fair or foul to the eye, and not in the heart, which is often fairest, freshest, and most free, when the skin is dark and the cheeks are rough. This young parson expected Patience to sympathize with him, to greet for him, to aid him if there might be aid, and to understand that for him the world would be blank and wretched
unless he could get for himself a soft, sweet mate, to sing when he sang, and to wail when he wailed. The only mate that Patience had was this very girl that was to be thus taken from her. But she did sympathize with him, did greet for him, and did give him all her aid. Knowing what she was herself, and how God had formed her, she had learned to bury self absolutely, and to take all her earthly joy from the joys of others. Shall it not come to pass that, hereafter, she too shall have a lover among the cherubim? "What can I say to you?" replied Patience to the young man's earnest entreaty. "If she were mine to give, I would give her to you instantly." "Then you think there is no chance. If I thought that, why should I trouble her again?" "I do not say so. Do you not know, Mr. Newton, that in such matters even sisters can hardly tell their thoughts to each other? How can they when they do not even know their own wishes?" "She does not hate me, then?" "Hate you, no. She does not hate you. But there are so many degrees between hating and that kind of love which you want from her. You may be sure of this, that she so esteems you that your persistence cannot lessen you in her regard." He was still pleading his case with the elder sister, very uselessly indeed, as he was aware, but having fallen on the subject of his love, it was impossible for him to change it for any other, when Clarissa came into the room, swinging her hat in her hand. She had been over at Miss Spooner's house, and was full of Miss Spooner's woes and complaints. As soon as she had shaken hands with her lover, and spoken the few words of courtesy which the meeting demanded of her, she threw herself into the affairs of Miss Spooner as though they were of vital interest. "She is determined to be unhappy, Patty, and it is no use trying to make her not so. She says that Jane robs her, which I don't believe is true, and that Sarah has a lover, and why shouldn't Sarah have a lover? But as for curing her grievances, it would be the cruellest thing in the world. She lives upon her grievances. Something has happened to the chimney pot, and the landlord hasn't sent a mason. She is revelling in her chimney pot." "Poor dear Miss Spooner," said Patience, getting up and leaving the room, as though it were her duty to look at once after her old friend in the midst of these troubles. Clarissa had not intended this. "She's asleep now," said Clarissa, but Patience went all the same. It might be that Miss Spooner would require to be watched in her slumbers. When Patience was gone, Gregory Newton got up from his seat and walked to the window. He stood there for what seemed to be an endless number of seconds before he returned, and Clarissa had time to determine that she would escape. "I told Mary that I would go to her," she said. "You won't mind being left alone for a few minutes, Mr. Newton?" "Do not go just now, Clarissa." "Only that I said I would," she answered, pleading that she must keep a promise which she had never made. "Mary can spare you, and I cannot. Mary is staying with you, and I shall be gone almost immediately. I go back to Newton to morrow, and who can say when I shall see you again?" "You will be coming up to London, of course." "I am here now, at any rate," he said, smiling, "and will take what advantage of it I can." "It is the old story, Clarissa, so old that I know you must be sick of it." "If you think so, you should not tell it again." "Do not be ill-natured to me. I don't know why it is, but a man gets to be ashamed of himself, as though he were doing something mean and paltry, when he loves with persistence, as I do." Had it been possible that she should give him so much encouragement, she would have told him that the mean man and paltry was he who could love or pretend to love with no capacity for persistency. She could not fail to draw a comparison between him and his brother, in which there was so much of meanness on the part of him who had at one time been as a god to her, and so much nobility in him to whom she was and ever had been as a goddess. "I suppose a man should take an answer and have done with it," he continued. "But how is a man to have done with it when his heart remains the same?" "A man should master his heart." "I am, then, to understand that that which you have said so often before must be said again?" He had never knelt to her, and he did not kneel now, but he leaned over her so that she hardly knew whether he was on his knees or still seated on his chair. And she herself, though she answered him briskly, almost with impertinence, was so little mistress of herself that she knew not what she said. She would take him now, if only she knew how to take him without disgracing herself in her own estimation. "Dear Clary, think of it. Try to love me. I need not tell you again how true is my love for you." He had hold of her hand, and she did not withdraw it, and he ought to have known that the battle was won. But he knew nothing. He hardly knew that her hand was in his. "Clary, you are all the world to me. Must I go back heart-laden but empty-handed with no comfort?" "If you knew all," she said, rising suddenly from her chair. "All what?" "If you knew all, you would not take me, though I offered myself." He stood staring at her, not at all comprehending her words, and she perceived in the midst of her distress that it was needful that she should explain herself. "I have loved Ralph always. Yes, your brother." "And he?" "I will not accuse him in anything. He is married now, and it is past." "And you can never love again?" "Who would care to take such a heart as that? It would not be worth the giving or worth the taking. Oh, how I loved him!" Then he left her side and went back to the window, while she sank back upon her chair, and burying her face in her hands gave way to tears and sobs. He stood there, perhaps for a minute, and then returning to her so gently that she did not hear him, he did kneel at her side. He knelt, and putting his hand upon her arm, he kissed the sleeve of her gown. "You had better go for me now," she said amidst her sobs. "I will never go from you again," he answered. "God's mercy can cure also that wound, and I will be his minister in healing it. Clarissa, I am so glad that you have told me all. Looking back, I can understand it now. I once thought that it was so." "Yes," she said, "yes, it was so." Gradually one hand of hers fell into his, and though no words of acceptance had been spoken, he knew that he was at last accepted. "My own Clary," he said, "I may call you my own?" There was no answer, but he knew that it was so. "Nothing shall be done to trouble you. Nothing shall be said to press you. You may be sure of this, if it be good to be loved, that no woman was ever loved more tenderly than you are." "I do know it," she said through her tears. Then he rose and stood again at the window, looking out upon the lawn and the river. She was still weeping, but he hardly heeded her tears. It was better for her that she should weep than restrain them. And as to himself and his own feelings, he tried to question himself whether in truth he was less happy in this great possession which he had at last gained, because his brother had for a while interfered with him in gaining it. That she would be as true to him now, as tender and as loving, as though Ralph had never crossed her path, he did not for a moment doubt. That she would be less sweet to him because her sweetness had been offered to another, he would not admit to himself, even though the question were asked. She would be all his own, and was she not the one thing in the world which he coveted? He did think that for such a one as his Clarissa he would be a better mate than would have been his brother, and he was sure that she herself would learn to know that it was so. He stood there long enough to resolve that this which had been told him should be no drawback upon his bliss. "Clary," he said, returning to her, "is it settled?" She made him no answer. "My darling, I am as happy now as though Ralph had never seen your sweet face, or heard your dear voice. Look up at me once." Slowly she looked up into his eyes, and then stood before him almost as a suppliant, and gave him her face to be kissed. So at last they became engaged as man and wife, though it may be doubted whether she spoke another word before he left the room. It was, however, quite understood that they were engaged, and though he did not see Clarissa again, he received the congratulations both of Patience and Mary Bonner before he left the house, and that very night succeeded in hunting down Sir Thomas, so that he might tell the father that the daughter had at last consented to become his wife. Chapter 58 of Ralph the Heir, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conclusion. Clarissa had found it hard to change the object of her love, so hard that for a time she had been unwilling even to make the effort, and she had been ashamed that those around her should think that she would make it. But when the thing was done, her second hero was dearer to her than ever had been the first. He at least was true. With him there was no need of doubt. His assurances were not conveyed in words so light that they might mean much or little. This second lover was a lover indeed, who thought no pains too great to show her that she was ever growing in his heart of hearts. For a while, for a week or two, she restrained her tongue, but when once she had accustomed herself to the coaxing kindness of her sister and her cousin, then her eloquence was loosened, and Gregory Newton was a god indeed. In the course of time she got a very pretty note from Ralph, congratulating her, as he also had congratulated Polly, and expressing a fear that he might not be home in time to be present at the wedding. Augusta was so fond of Rome that they did not mean to leave it till the late spring. Then, after a while, there came to her also a watch and chain, twice as costly as those given to Polly, which, however, no persuasion from Gregory would ever induce Clarissa to wear. In after time Ralph never noticed that the trinkets were not worn. The winter at Popham Villa went on very much as other winters had gone, except that two of the girls living there were full of future hopes, and preparing for future cares, while the third occupied her heart and mind with the cares and hopes of the other two. Patience, however, had one other task in hand, a task upon the performance of which her future happiness much depended, and in respect to which she now ventured to hope for success. Wherever her future home might be, it would be terrible to her if her father would not consent to occupy it with her. It had been settled that both the marriages should take place early in April, both on the same day, and, as a matter of course, the weddings would be celebrated at Fulham. Christmas had come and gone, and winter was going, before Sir Thomas had absolutely promised to renew that order for the making of the packing cases for his books. "You won't go back, papa, after they are married?" Patience said to her father early in March. "If I do, it shall not be for long."
"Not for a day, papa. Surely you will not leave me alone. There will be plenty of room now. The air of Fulham will be better for your work than those stuffy, dark, dingy lawyers' chambers."
"My dear, all the work of my life that was worth doing was done in those stuffy, dingy rooms." That was all that Sir Thomas said, but the accusation conveyed to him by his daughter's words was very heavy. For years past he had sat intending to work, purposing to achieve a great task which he set for himself, and had done almost nothing. Might it be yet possible that that purer air of which Patty spoke should produce new energy, and lead to better results? The promise of it did at least produce new resolutions. It was impossible, as Patience had said, that his child should be left to dwell alone, while yet she had a father living. "Stemm," he said, "I told you to get some packing cases made." "Packing cases, Sir Thomas?" "Yes, packing cases for the books. It was months ago. Are they ready?" "No, Sir Thomas, they ain't ready." "Why not?" "Well, Sir Thomas, they ain't, that's all." Then the order was repeated in a manner so formal as to make Stemm understand that it was intended for a fact. "You are going away from this, are you, Sir Thomas?" "I believe that I shall give the chambers up altogether at midsummer. At any rate, I mean to have the books packed at once." "Very well, Sir Thomas." Then there was a pause, during which Stemm did not leave the room. Nor did Sir Thomas dismiss him, feeling that there might well be other things which would require discussion. "And about me, Sir Thomas?" said Stemm. "I have been thinking about that, Stemm." "So have I, Sir Thomas, more nor once." "You can come to Fulham if you like, only you must not scold the maids." "Very well, Sir Thomas," said Stemm, with hardly any variation in his voice, but still with less of care upon his brow. "Mind, I will not have you scolding them at the villa." "Not unless they deserve it, Sir Thomas," said Stemm. Sir Thomas could say nothing further. For our own part, we fear that the maidens at the villa will not be the better in conduct, as they certainly will not be more comfortable in their lives, in consequence of this change. And the books were moved in large packing cases, not one of which had yet been opened when the two brides returned to Popham Villa after their wedding tours, to see Patience just for a day, before they were taken to their new homes. Nevertheless, let us hope that the change of air and of scene may tend to future diligence, and that the magnus opus may yet be achieved. We have heard of editions of Aristophanes or Polybius, of the Iliad or Ovid, and what not, which have ever been forthcoming under the hands of notable scholars, who have grown grey amidst the renewed promises which have been given. And some of these works have come forth, belying the prophecies of incredulous friends. Let us hope that the great life of Bacon may yet be written. End of chapter 58. End of Ralph the Heir.